Question. It's always a little bit awkward when there's a breaking news story when we're doing cross question, but we are going to keep you across what's happening in the New York courthouse. A photo has been released of Donald Trump, and that's all I think we're going to get. We don't know whether he's going to address the media after the proceedings have finished. I suspect not, but he will be addressing the American people from Mar-a-Lago at 1:15 a.m. So you'll be able to hear that live with Richard Spur a bit later on. Let me tell you who's on my panel for cross question. To my left is Heidi Alexander, who I think was one of the first people I ever interviewed on LBC back in 2010. Long time ago, Heidi. She's former Labour MP, Shadow Health Secretary and Deputy Mayor of London, and she's now a Labour candidate for the next general election in Swindon South, or South Swindon, whichever you like. Greg Swenson is next to her, Chair of Republicans Overseas UK, who works in investment banking, but don't hold that against him. Andy Silvester, to my right, is editor of the business-focused newspaper City AM, and presents our business update every day on the programme. And Michael Walker is a contributing editor for Novara Media and host of its Novara live show. So many things for you to call in about today. 0345 6060 973. You might want to phone in about Donald Trump. You might want to phone in about the fact the government has halved the funds it had planned to give to England's social care sector. Rishi Sunak's popularity among Conservative Party members is soaring, but most of the public still don't know what Keir Starmer stands for. TikTok has been fined nearly £13 million for breaching British data laws. Those companies responsible for polluting our rivers and seas will be asked to pay the full bill for cleaning them up. That was announced today, and teachers in England are going on strike for yet another 5 days. Plenty to get our teeth into, but if you've got another subject you want to phone in about, please feel free to do so. 0345 6060 973, 84850 on the text, and say to Alexa, send a comment to LBC, and you can put your question that way. And we hope you're watching us on Global Player.
Call 0345 6060 973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850. Cross question with Iain Dale. This is LBC.
Well, our first question is a text question from Phil in Oxford. Is the accession of Finland to NATO the biggest blunder that Putin has made in the Ukraine war? Greg?
You could argue that. I mean, it's got a very, 1,000-kilometer or 1,000-mile border, and there's some real history there. You know, the devastating battle they fought, I think it was right before World War II or at the beginning of World War II. So there's some legacy there, and Finland maintained neutrality for a very long time, and in spite of the fact that they were the front line against the Soviet Union. So yeah, this could be a real blunder for Putin.
And the Finnish people have always traditionally supported being neutral, just as they have it in Sweden. So I think this is a major story, which has been rather eclipsed today by events
a lot of news has
in
been
the
eclipsed.
United States.
Yeah.
But strategically, also, it is incredibly important. And I haven't seen any comment from the Kremlin today on this, but Michael Walker, they must be smarting, I would have thought.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I think the war in Ukraine has completely backfired for Putin. I suppose potentially we could overstate how significant the accession of Finland is for Vladimir Putin. Yes, it's got this huge border, but the association with Ukraine, I think, was more fundamental, more cultural. That was part of the former Soviet Union. Obviously, Finland wasn't. So I do think Vladimir Putin probably sees Ukraine and Georgia differently to that which he does Finland. But clearly, if your aim was to stop NATO expansion and you start a war and then Finland and Sweden join NATO, that doesn't seem like an act of strategic
Well, particularly
genius.
Because NATO has been accused of sort of creeping up on Russia's borders, but I mean, with this massive land border that Finland has, Putin will no doubt want to point that out as much as he can.
Absolutely. Well, will he want to point that out as much as he can? I assume that this is not being talked about much from the Kremlin because they don't particularly want the Russian public to be talking about Finland joining NATO, because there aren't many ways you can spin that. So I'm not sure how Vladimir Putin would turn that into a win.
Andy?
Yeah, I mean, I'd pretty much echo that entirely, I guess. This isn't a blunder, right? It's happened out of his hands. The blunder was a long time ago when he cooked up a fairly cockamamie plan to invade Ukraine and win a war in 3 days. We're seeing now the logical conclusions, I suppose, of years of botched policy on all sides, both in terms of Vladimir Putin's aggression and the West's inability to stand up to it at the time that it should have done, almost a decade ago. The question now is twofold, really. One, this gives, the mannequin piss in Brussels today was dressed up as in a little NATO costume, as it does on things like this today. The question for NATO is not necessarily about Finland joining it, it's about what's going on closer to Turkey and how long that situation, where you've essentially got Erdogan and NATO moving in two very separate directions, can sustain itself. And the question for Putin, as ever here, is there an exit strategy for him that allows him to stay in power? And until the answer to that second one is settled satisfiedly to Putin's satisfaction, it's been a long day, until that question is satisfied to Putin's satisfaction, we're going to be talking about Ukraine and a frozen conflict in the east of that country for a very long time.
It's interesting you mentioned Turkey there, because of course Turkey is threatening to veto Sweden's accession to NATO because they say that Sweden is harbouring Kurdish terrorists, which on the face of it seems an odd thing for Turkey to allege. But do you think that Sweden is going to be held up in the accession process?
I'm sure it'll be held up in the accession process, but I can't imagine that is going to prevent the other members of NATO forcing this through. The question is, of course, Erdogan has been a rogue actor when it comes to the response to the Russian war in Ukraine. He has turned, if not a blind eye, he's turned an active eye towards Russia's aggression and not stepped in the way that the rest of the West has, when you look at the way they're dealing with shipping through the Bosphorus and so on and so forth. I don't want to give the impression that this is in somehow bad news for NATO that Finland has joined, but there are more pressing questions, I think, that they need to deal with beyond the accession of what is a lovely country that you should all visit.
Heidi Alexander.
Yeah, so I think that Putin has basically achieved the exact opposite to that which he set out to achieve when he invaded Ukraine. He has essentially strengthened the alliance of democracies that makes up NATO, and when he invaded Ukraine, he was wanting to undermine it. So it has pretty spectacularly backfired. Interesting to see what happens with this process of Sweden joining. But NATO is clearly incredibly important to our security in Europe. And I think it's quite a historic day, Finland joining.
And do you think Putin realises that he's made a fundamental mistake? Or do you think he's still being fed by his military people sort of all the good news, if there is any good news, and he doesn't quite understand how catastrophic it has been for Russia?
I mean, who knows what's going on in the Kremlin? I think, we can all guess as to what is happening. I suspect he does realise that this isn't going exactly the way that he wanted it to go. I do think that when he set out on the invasion of Ukraine, he expected it to be over in a matter of days or weeks. And sadly for that country, they are still living through it. And the huge conflict that is still going on there.
There's a follow-up question here from Chris in Brecon, who says, does another Donald Trump presidency represent the biggest threat to Western and European political, military and social alliances for almost 80 years? Because, of course, we know Donald Trump has never been a fan of NATO. I think I don't wish to put words in his mouth, but I'm going to anyway. I think he would have happily withdrawn America from NATO, but couldn't quite get to do that. Michael, do you think a second Trump presidency might embolden him?
Yeah, and it does seem to me a little bit risky that the Europeans do seem to be really throwing their lot in with the Americans at this point in time. I mean, especially with the Labour Party sort of saying NATO is sacrosanct. No, I'm not saying we should leave NATO, but I do think we should be flexible when it comes to foreign policy alliances, especially when you've got an ally such as the United States, where it's not just about Trump, but it's a two-party system, and one of the parties is completely off the wall, right? So the idea that we have a solid, unbreakable alliance with this country, to me, it doesn't seem particularly smart. I think it's also worth, when we're talking about, the war in Ukraine, yes, Putin has made a catastrophic error. Yes, he's getting a bloody nose here. But we also have to think, what's the way out? How is this going to end? It's not really good enough for us to just sort of say, yip-de-doo-da-day, this bad guy has taken a hit. How are we going to find a solution which isn't just an eternal war? Because that does seem to be what we're heading for at the moment. So I feel like the cheerleading for NATO versus the bad Putin, yes, I mean, there's obviously some truth to it, but that's not really how we should be doing foreign policy.
Greg?
Well, I have to defend Trump a bit here. His complaints about NATO. Well, no, and I don't do it just by nature. I pick my issues, and I think what Trump's delivery, his messaging is always clumsy. So threatening that he was, going to withdraw the U.S. from NATO, I don't think he was serious. I think that what he was saying is that a lot of the NATO countries weren't spending 2% of their GDP on defense, which they should be. Some of them have upgraded a bit and have joined the 2% club. Some of them still haven't. So I think, if anything, Trump would be thrilled that Finland is joining, because they are very tough people, and they have a very well-developed military. And I don't know what the GDP number is there, but I'm guessing it's a lot higher than 2%. So, these are complaints that are delivered, again, in a clumsy manner. He had the sit down in 2018 with the Germans, where he complained about that they were not spending the biggest economy in Europe was not spending their 2% of GDP. Complained that they were buying too much energy from the Russians. Everybody made fun of him. Turns out he had a point on both issues.
But what about his relationship with Vladimir Putin? Because he has said recently, hasn't he, that, well, if he became president, the Ukraine war would be finished within a few days.
And that's classic Trump blunder. It's take him. What did they say? Don't take him literally, but take him seriously. There is some merit to the argument that some of these things might not have happened if Trump was still in. He was very generous with military support for the Ukrainians after the Obama administration, which would only send non-lethal support in trucks from Poland without U.S. flags on them. So there was a lot of caution in the Obama administration in terms of support for Ukraine. What Trump did was he would speak about relationships with Putin, and I can work it out, and that horrible visit in Finland, and yet he was actually much more deliberate in. He punished Russia in Syria. He supported Ukraine with Javelin missiles and other military, lethal support. So, it's sometimes, I know it's painful, but sometimes you have to look at what he does and what he's accomplished, and not at what he says, because what he says is quite often clumsy.
Fair comment, Heidi?
Well, I'm not sure, actually, because I think we live in 2023, and what the leader of America, the president of America, says can have far-reaching ramifications on geopolitics. What has struck me about the last 24 hours is, for the first time in 2 years, I've woken up with Donald Trump on the airwaves again, leading the news bulletins. And I just reflected upon the fact that, since Joe Biden has been president, I haven't been waking up in the morning worrying about what the president of the United States has said overnight, because I actually do feel that when he was president, things could have gone quite badly wrong in the world.
Well, to be fair to him, he didn't get involved in a war, did he? Unlike most of his predecessors.
Yeah, look,
Good point.
I just feel that there was huge volatility and instability with him in the White House, and I do feel that Joe Biden is a safer pair of hands there, and seeing Trump back on the airwaves again just makes me breathe a huge sigh of relief, to be honest.
Andy Silvester, when you look at the unity between NATO countries over Ukraine, I think that surprised a lot of people. But of course, the re-election of Donald Trump could shatter that again. I mean, it might be united against him, but if Donald Trump, contrary to what Greg says, does seek to undermine NATO again, that would be incredibly serious for European security.
Yeah, of course it would be. But following on from the points made, it's a little column A, a little column B, isn't it? Donald Trump was lashing out publicly at NATO when NATO was not a unified force against Ukraine. It didn't have anything to unify against. And frankly, I think a lot of people, and I confess I was one of these people, could never quite see a war in continental Europe happening again, because there's too many reasons it wouldn't. I was wrong. Many European leaders were wrong. Was Trump right? Did he think this would ever happen? Who's to say? At the same time, I agree with Heidi that words do matter. Trump hurt an awful lot of feelings. In some ways, particularly with the German comment about military spending, I think if he came back to office tomorrow, he would continue to hurt Germany's feelings, which has talked a tremendously good game about upping its military capacity and has done square root of not a lot since the invasion of Ukraine. Would it fracture the Western alliance? I think you would hope that in the face of a possibly mad fascist in the Kremlin, European leaders will be able to get their feelings hurt a little bit more than perhaps they would in the past. I do not think that even a Trump presidency would lead to the exit of the United States from NATO. I think if anything, it would probably lead to more bellicose rhetoric and perhaps more, how can I put this, external leadership. There's always internal leadership of organisations. There's also people who lead it from the outside.
Well, I suppose it might encourage European countries to actually pay for their own defences rather than rely on the United States, which we've done ever since the Second World War, really. Thank you very much for those questions. We'll move on to another subject in just a moment with our panel. If you'd like to ask them a question, the number to call 0345 6060 973. It's 17 minutes past 8.
LBC.
On LBC, Labour candidate for Swindon South. Is it South Swindon or Swindon South? Does it matter?
Well, it's currently South Swindon, but if the boundary changes go through, it could be Swindon South. So just go for whatever you prefer, Ian.
You say tomato, I say tomato.
Exactly.
Right. This is Heidi Alexander we're talking about. Greg Swenson is here from Republicans Overseas UK. Andy Silvester is editor of City AM, and Michael Walker is from Novara Media. Let's go to Ben in Clacton. Hello, Ben.
Hello, Ian, and good evening, panel.
Hi.
My question is, how can we trust Rishi Sunak's pledges when a pledge was made in 2021 to fund social care? It was 500 million. It's now been cut by half to 250 million. Obviously, bed blocking will go up. So why do you think he's done that?
Boris Johnson obviously was Prime Minister then. I suppose you could argue, well, okay, it's the same party in government, but it is a different government, so they will have their own priorities. Now, like you, I would have thought social care ought to be a main priority. But Heidi Alexander, let's start with you on this. Free open goal for you.
Well, I don't think we can trust Rishi Sunak's promises, and I don't think we can trust the Conservatives' promises on social care. And the question that I would ask is, how much longer are we going to try and kick this can down the road? We've got a huge number of people in this country, older people, disabled people, who are going without the care packages that they need. We've got massive workforce challenges. I think today the figure came out that it was over 160,000 vacancies in the social care workforce. To put it bluntly, people can earn more stacking shelves at Tesco's than they earn caring for people and providing dignity to older people and disabled people. And we also know, of course, that last year the government got rid of the cap that they said that they were going to introduce on catastrophic care costs. So people who perhaps get Alzheimer's, dementia when they're older, and can spend over £100,000 on their care. In the Jeremy Hunt budget, he had to get rid of that because of the absolutely catastrophic mess that Liz Truss had made with the economy. And so I don't think we can trust them. I do think it has to be sorted for exactly the reasons that your caller has pointed out. The pressure that we're experiencing in the NHS at the moment is linked directly to the crisis in social care. There are a huge number of people who are medically fit to be discharged from hospital, but because the residential care isn't available or the care in people's homes isn't available, they can't be moved out of hospital, and that causes this huge backlog. So you can't move people from A&E into the wards because you can't move people out from the wards into social care. And so, I do think that we have got to find a way of tackling this on a cross-party basis. I remember when I was first elected as a Member of Parliament in Lewisham in 2010, we were having discussions about this then. 13 years have gone by, the situation's got worse and worse. And so I think it's pretty disgraceful what they've done, backtracking on the promises that they made.
Andy Silvester.
They've done it because there's no money. I don't know if anyone's noticed, but there isn't any.
You can always find money in the Treasury if you really need to.
You can.
250 million, that is chicken feed in terms of Treasury budget.
Well, it's certainly chicken feed in terms of the NHS budget, which is, of course, where these two budgets are supposed to be joined up. Parking the dreadful precedent of a politician not entirely telling the truth and possibly doing something other than what he said, which I could never imagine happening before. Arguing about whether 250 million or 500 million, the implication of this argument is that if it was £500 million that we managed to find, then all would be well and all would be solved. And that's mad. It's like arguing whether this asteroid that we're staring at, called a completely broken and wildly expensive NHS and an ageing population and an ungrowing economy, is going to take us out by landing in Sussex or Surrey. There has to be, I agree, a cross-party commission. There also has to be some honesty. We need to stop saying the NHS is in crisis and pointing at the Tories or whoever is in power. Because I can promise if the Labour Party win in a year's time, the NHS is still going to be in crisis because the thing is broken. Because we don't have the capacity within our politics to reform it. And I'm afraid I haven't heard anything from Keir Starmer that suggests to me that if he's in charge, he would do anything other than find some more cash in the Treasury, pump it into this gigantic black hole, exactly where we are in 5 years' time, but with an older population and an even slower growing economy. So I'm a little tired of these funding rows over, as you put it, chicken feed, when no one's willing to actually do any kind of...
You are sounding very tired, Andy.
It's been a long one. Editing a daily newspaper is a challenging business.
Now, I hate this phrase that increasing funding for the NHS is putting money into a black hole, because it's not. It's paying the wages of doctors and nurses and NHS staff to care for people and to operate on them, right?
It's not doing that anymore.
Well, it clearly is doing that. And to defend, I'm not particularly a New Labourite, but if you want to see can the NHS work, you just have to look at New Labour. I think they did a lot wrong. I don't think they should have gone to war in Iraq. But when you look at
Novara media,
when you look at people's satisfaction with the NHS by the end of 2010, it was incredibly high. We had a health service which, in some studies, was top of the league tables, in other studies was mid-table, but no one was saying that this was a completely broken system.
Famously,
what has happened now? We've had an ageing population, which means we're going to have to spend more of our GDP on health. The Tories, until the last 2 years, when they're flooding it with money, but obviously if you grind something down to breaking point, then flooding it with money over a 2-year period is not going to suddenly get rid of the waiting list, because you have to train people, you have to employ people. That's not how this thing works. So I do think if we had a settlement where we funded the NHS properly, then that would take us a long way. We don't really need to reinvent the wheel.
Which schools are you closing?
Well, I would increase, and this would be my beef with. No, I don't want to sound too New Labour here, because this would be my beef with Keir Starmer and the Labour Party at the moment. Is they're not being honest with this, which is that if we want to have a decent health service when we've got an ageing population, we are going to have to increase taxes, and we're going to have to especially increase taxes on the rich, right?
And if we've got a tax burden that's at a 70-year high.
Yeah, but we've also got a much lower tax burden than many of the countries which we might look at and say, oh, actually, their health system works pretty well.
Yeah,
right?
but largely because they have systems that blend private and public, and that's apparently heresy in the British.
Well, I don't think it needs to be heresy. So there are health systems which work okay, which are social insurance systems and NHS systems when they're funded properly, as they were under Labour governments. There's a health system which doesn't work, which is the American model. I think we all agree we don't want that. So you can have social insurance, you can have a national health service. We could spend loads and loads of money switching to a social insurance system, which isn't really in our culture or our economic structures. Or we could just say, let's tax the rich a little bit more so we can fund the NHS properly. And if you fund it properly for about 5 years, I can pretty much guarantee you the waiting lists are going to come down.
Greg, do you look at this with a slight degree of amusement, or?
No, I never look at the safety net with any kind of amusement. It's the problem with safety net is once you make those commitments, you have to stick to them. So, I get it, but I'm with Andy on this one. There's no money, and if you raise taxes on the so-called rich or the corporations, the revenues will go down. So if you want more revenue, this is the great model. I mean, I hate to get all supply sider on you, but if you lower the rate on the rich, because they're productive and they invest and they have already paid taxes on their money, usually, and lower the corporate rate, the revenues will go up. And that's what we all want, right? We want more. I mean,
sounding very 1980s. I'm not sure that
it is a throwback. It is a throwback. I know I'm sounding like Liz Truss, but
nothing wrong with the 1980s, Michael.
But when you raise the corporate rate, for example, revenues are either flat or go down. So lower the rates, you'll get more revenue, which the left should want. More stuff to spend, more money to spend on.
I want to tax wealth because you can't move it, right?
Difficult to tax wealth, really difficult, and unintended consequences too. Like you'll hide it, or there's always ways to get around it. But if you lower the rate, the revenues will go up, and I think that's what the left would want: more revenues for the government.
Just to say, Donald Trump has just left the courtroom in Manhattan. He got straight into his car. His motorcade has now driven off. He didn't say anything to reporters, having been warned by the judge about his use of language. I'd like to hear the reaction to that. Now, we are expecting the Manhattan District Attorney to make a public statement in the next few minutes, which we will bring to you when we get it. We're told it's 8:30, but these things often drift a little bit, don't they? So in the meantime, let's get the LBC News headlines from Tim Daly.
Donald Trump has pleaded not guilty after being formally arrested in New York and put before a courtroom in Manhattan. It's been hearing he faces 34 charges of falsifying business records. It follows an investigation into hush money allegedly paid to an adult movie actress in 2016. In the last few minutes, it's also emerged the judge he was appearing before has warned him about his use of language and the targeting of legal figures on social media. And a former Metropolitan Police officer has been found guilty of raping a woman. 26-year-old Ireland Murdoch was dismissed last year after he searched for her name in a police database. LBC weather, outbreaks of rain for West Scotland and Northern Ireland tonight. Patchy rain spreading east, but staying dry in the southeast. A low of -1 degree.
This is LBC.
3 on LBC. Just to bring you up to date, Donald Trump is being driven presumably to one of the New York airports, where he will then be flying back to Florida, to Mar-a-Lago, where he's going to make a public statement at 1:15 UK time tomorrow morning. I think I'm going to stay up for that. I think that could be quite sparky. And we are expecting the District Attorney of Manhattan to make a public statement outside the courtroom at some point in the next, could be the next minute, it could be the next half an hour. I don't know, but we will bring it to you when we can. Right, panel on Cross Question. Let me just reintroduce them to you. Heidi Alexander is here. She's standing for South Swindon in the next election. Now, you were MP for Lewisham.
That's right.
You quit being an MP for Lewisham. You weren't defeated.
That's right.
Because of Jeremy Corbyn, wasn't it, really?
Well, I was offered a job by Sadiq Khan, who is the Mayor of London, as his deputy, being responsible for transport, and as someone that went into politics to make a difference. It was an offer I couldn't refuse. I think it's probably pretty well known that I wasn't Jeremy Corbyn's number one fan. I was the first person to resign from his shadow cabinet back in 2016. So I spent 3.5 years, working with Sadiq in City Hall.
And you want to get back in, and did you immediately miss the House of Commons?
No, not immediately. I think I spent 3.5 years working with Sadiq and everyone at Transport for London, a brilliant team there. We kept the buses and the tubes running through COVID. We eventually got the Elizabeth line open, which is absolutely fantastic.
I haven't been on it yet.
You haven't?
No,
it is
everyone
amazing.
says it's fantastic.
It is great. But after COVID, I guess I thought to myself, I'm 47 years old. What do I want to do with the rest of my... I am.
Never.
Yeah, this grey hair definitely tells its own story. And so I miss the sense of mission that you get from being a Member of Parliament, and I realised that unless we win in places like South Swindon, we are not going to form a Labour government next time round.
And of course, that's where you were born and brought up.
That's where I was born and brought up. And so I was selected last summer to be the candidate there. So, it's all good fun.
Greg Swenson is with us from Republicans Overseas UK. Andy Silvester is from City AM, and Michael Walker from Novara Media. Now, you're either going to like this next question, Heidi, or you're going to hate it. It's Robert in Chiswick. Robert, hello. What would you like to ask?
Yeah, good evening, Ian. Thank you for taking my call. Good evening, panel. My question to the panel is I'd like to get their views on Sadiq Khan pushing ahead with the ULEZ expansion despite the cost of living crisis that we're seeing at the moment, please.
Now, the judgment on an attempt by the London boroughs of Bexley, Bromley, Harrow and Hillingdon, and also Surrey County Council, to secure an injunction to prevent the ULEZ expansion taking place in late August is apparently imminent. And of course, the ULEZ stands for the Ultra Low Emission Zone. It was first introduced in 2019 when you were London's Deputy Mayor for Transport, Heidi. Now, it's very interesting that this has provoked a huge controversy, particularly among our London listeners. I mean, every day I'm getting emails, texts about it. It's really created a lot of controversy. Now, you presumably were behind this. And do you think it should still go ahead in its current form, or should there be a pause?
So when I was the Deputy Mayor, we introduced the ultra-low emission zone in central London in the same area as the congestion charging zone. That came in 2019, and then in 2021 we expanded it out to the North and South Circular. When I left City Hall, the Mayor and my successor, Seb Dance, and the board at Transport for London had a discussion about what next in terms of emissions charging in London, and the Mayor decided to extend it to the Greater London boundary. I think the ultra-low emission zone had an utterly transformative effect on air pollution in central London, and I think that people in outer London deserve clean air in the same way as people in inner London do. I know very well the family of Ella Kissa Deborah, who sadly died from asthma-related conditions, and there was a judgment basically that her death was linked to really, really horrific air quality.
Last time we talked about this, her mother phoned in.
Yeah, Rosamond.
Yeah.
And Rosamond has been making the case that, you know, this shouldn't just be the preserve clean air of people in inner and central London. What I would say is that about 9 in 10 vehicles will meet the emission standards that are required by the ultra-low emission zone. So not every vehicle that's coming in to London or driving in Greater London is going to be charged. It's a small minority of vehicles. We also saw a really rapid acceleration in the vehicle fleet cleaning itself up, people buying new cars, new vehicles, in order to be compliant and not have to face the charge.
What do you say to the many people who've got small businesses who do rely on vehicles that don't qualify?
So obviously the Mayor of London has put £50 million into a scrappage scheme, and small businesses can apply. Certainly when I was in City Hall, we targeted that scheme on the smallest businesses and charities to help them with purchasing a cleaner vehicle so that they could be compliant. You know, I do understand that it's a difficult time for businesses at the moment, and in terms of household finances, with everything going on with the cost of living, I get it. But I do think that the Mayor has been really quite bold and brave in saying we do need to clean up London's air. We also need to tackle climate change and carbon emissions. 25% of carbon emissions in the UK come from transport. Okay. And so I think he's been bold and he's been brave, and I think the scrappage fund is the right thing to do. I'd also like to see government actually fund a scrappage fund in South East England. What the government have done is basically just throw money towards their mates in other parts of the country instead of establishing a national scrappage fund, and I think that's what they should be doing.
Andy Silvester, is this exercising your readers?
As exercising our readers, to be honest, no, not particularly. Just because our readers tend to be business folk who don't necessarily have to deal with some of these issues. Heidi is right that the fleet of cars on the road is obviously cleaning itself up. You know, it just stands to reason that will continue to happen in outer London. The scrappage scheme is relatively generous. I think there are a lot of people just outside the borders, as Heidi alluded to. So think of places like Epsom or down in, just as you cross the border into Kent, that are worried, quite rightly, that as a small business that has to operate in London, they're going to have to drive in and will not get the benefit from this. There's never a good time. There's never a good time to do something like this. There's never a good time to say to people that we're going to charge you more. Against all of my instincts, and genuinely all of my instincts, having gone to a school next to a very busy road in Sutton and out of London, I've been running around parks there as an 11, 12-year-old. There were, next to idling cars sat by the bus stop for a long time. I doubt it was good for me.
That's why you're so tired.
That's why I'm so tired. I was just looking at the South London upbringing is what's making me so tired. No, look, I can completely feel the sympathy. I think the scrappage scheme could be more generous. But look, again, it's sort of, we're arguing about one step towards what we all know is coming in 5 to 10 to 15 to 20 years, which is a road pricing scheme based on how green your car is. That's effectively where we're getting to. And ULEZ is using the same technology that can be used to do that. So if people think that that's the start of a slippery slope, then they can think it's the start of a slippery slope. But that's just the nature of it.
Okay. Greg Swenson.
Hard to argue for taxes that Michael mentioned, taxing the rich or corporations that will slow growth and development and actually slow revenues. But I especially don't like regressive taxes, which this ultimately is when you're taxing working people and small businesses. And small businesses are the driver of job growth, typically. And so I just can't endorse that,
what about the argument which, Andy and Heidi both said, well, it's effectively, it's very difficult to argue against clean air. And if this is as transformational as Heidi says it was in central London, why would anyone be against it?
Well, because it's a tax on working people and small business. So
the other thing to remember about car ownership in London is that you are more likely to own a car the wealthier you are. So the poorer you are, the less likely you are to own a car, full stop.
Yeah.
And so for you to say this is a regressive tax, I'm just not sure that's true.
Yeah. But I think the context, we were talking about small business. So, I don't know the numbers on the percentages of cars that are affected and how rich or poor they are. But generally speaking, more regulation and regressive taxation is going to be, the people that suffer the most are typically the working people and the small
It is by definition a regressive tax because it's a flat fee, and therefore if you have less money, it hits more. That's just the definition of a regressive tax. I think the point about car ownership is fine. I think, actually, the more I think about this, the people I feel sorry for are the people that are not going to have access to this scrappage scheme at all, that are just outside their border, that have to come into London. And my answer to that would naturally be to expand London and the remits of the mayor and London's central government, and London's government, so that it has the power to do more things and raise more cash within both its area and the hinterland just outside
I'm sure Sadiq would agree with you. Michael Walker.
I think, first of all, let's just push back against this idea that you can't have higher taxes and growth. I mean, lots of the countries that have much higher incomes than us also have higher levels of tax, right? So if you want to live in a healthy, wealthy society, there is nothing wrong with having higher levels of tax. Look at Germany, look at France, etc., etc. Wouldn't it be great if we were protesting about our pension age rising from 62 to 64 instead of taking 67 as sort of the given? But on this issue of ULEZ and ultra-low emission zone, I can't drive. I'm not actually on top of the politics
We have no right to comment
of driving in this country. I do live in a low-traffic neighbourhood, which I really enjoy, where my parents are from in Leighton. That one of their big roads got turned into a low-traffic neighbourhood. I think the business argument is strange because everyone always says, if people can't drive to the shops are going to lose money. The road, which is a low traffic neighbourhood, has flourished since the cars have stopped going down it. You now have kids running around in the street. It feels very continental. So I'm very pro the politics of making London less car friendly and more people friendly.
This is the delivery question, though, isn't it, for small businesses? It's people, tradesmen coming in, blah, 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 to work in London, but it's also the knock-on effect for small businesses because the price of what they're buying from small suppliers using polluting fleets, etc., might go up. It's worth saying that you're right, the big businesses have already invested in green fleets because, as you know, because they've all got bloody advertising.
I
think
it's difficult. It is difficult. There is a mayoral election in May of next year. Fundamentally, rightly or wrongly, Sadiq Khan has made a choice. He's made no bones about making a choice. And I dare say there will be some consequences from some people. And if the Tory candidate, whoever that is, and I know there are ongoing live discussions about who that might be, comes in and promises to repeal ULEZ, then that is what democracy is about. And
I just wonder how significant, I agree, it is a big issue in that belt around London. I just wonder whether it is sort of in inner London.
Without going all political analysis, it's 1 out of 10 people in that belt that will have to pay it. And once people start to feel, hang on, do I not have to pay it? I've got a greener car. Maybe it disappears as an issue. We shall see.
We will indeed. Thank you very much for your answers on that. We'll move on. Robert, thank you for your question. It's 8:45.
LBC.
Of Heidi Alexander, Greg Swenson, Andy Silvester and Michael Walker with us answering your questions. The next one is a text question from Paul in Paisley. Can the party responsible for emancipation and for votes for women in America ever be respectable again? Let's ask the head of Republicans Overseas UK, Greg Swenson.
I think it's quite respectable, and I think you have to separate the Trump derangement syndrome from the party and from conservatives in America, so that the conservative movement is alive and well. Half the country voted for Republicans. I can give you all the stats. We picked up 14 seats in 2020. We picked up another handful in 2022. Yes, it's a divided country, but people aren't necessarily voting Republican because of Trump. In fact, if anything, he was an electoral liability in 2018, 20, and 22. So the party's alive and well, and I think the conservative movement is alive and well, and I think you'll see that in the elections, whether it's Trump or Ron DeSantis or Nikki Haley or whoever. Let the process work.
But Ronald Reagan, George H.W. Bush, Richard Nixon, I would suggest also, are probably spinning in their respective graves at the moment at the way the Republican Party has developed over the last 20 years. It's become less of a political party, more of a quasi-religious sect, hasn't it? I mean, it's so ideological that it's lost touch with the people, the centrist people who used to vote for it.
Well, I think that the ideology hasn't really changed that much. In fact, many will argue that it's the same old, as Michael pointed out, it's giving my 1980s back. But the ideology hasn't changed that much. I think the Democrats have moved very far to the left. What's changed is that, and this is what happened with Trump in 2016, he appealed to the sort of common man, the people that had been forgotten about, the Rust Belt, if you want to call it that. And that's something that the establishment Republicans had overlooked. So I don't think there's a lot of change in policy. It's not extreme in terms of policies. It's just changed in terms of who the appeal is to. So all of a sudden, in a generation, and this might annoy George W. Bush, who went to Yale, but it's the party now of the working man as opposed to the party of the country club. And that's what's changed. And now the Democrats have a lock on college-educated, high-earning, college grads. And that's different. It used to be the other way around. So that's what's changed.
Michael Walker, that is a fair point, isn't it? If you look at where it's a little bit similar here, if you look back at the 2019 election, where the Conservatives had 47% of the working class vote and Labour only had 32%. Similar phenomenon, as Greg is saying, in America. But, I mean, obviously you're not going to be very pro-Republican, but do you see that there is a way back in terms of the Republican Party moving back to the centre, or do you think it's made its bed and it will lie in it?
I mean, it seems very difficult to see how it would get anywhere else. I mean, it seems a bit like a party out of control, I have to say. I also think we shouldn't look, too warmly on Republicans who might have been a bit more respectable when it came to the language they use. I mean, we were talking earlier about words mattering. I do think words matter, but actions matter more. And George W. Bush, for all he's celebrated now as this person who seems to speak like how we imagine a president to speak, he did start an incredibly deadly war in the Middle East, which has killed many more people than Trump would.
Never mind.
Sorry, I was talking about W. I suppose on the question of the working class, I mean, the statistic you just used there with reference to 2019, I think that's potentially a little bit of an outdated sort of measure of class, because it's all about, are you a manual worker or a service worker? Now, what that will do is it will class lots of poor people in the inner city who work in very low-paid service jobs as middle class. So you have someone working in a call centre would be middle class by that basis. So what we are seeing, though, it is a genuine change, which is there are people, especially white people in sort of semi-rural areas or suburban areas, smaller towns, who have moved away from left-wing parties and towards, in this country, the Conservatives when Brexit was the big issue, and now to Donald Trump when, opposition to trade deals and migration is the big issue. That is a problem for the Democrats, for the Labour Party here. I don't think it's fair, though, to say that the Republicans or the Conservatives have become the party of the working man. Still, by a long way, wealthier people disproportionately vote for the Republicans and wealthy people disproportionately vote for the Conservatives here. The issue is there's this particular group of people who used to vote for the left-wing parties and now tend to vote for the right-wing parties, especially because of cultural issues. Also, many of them are homeowners, right? So there is also a sort of economic angle.
I'm going to ask you two to be quite brief, and then we can fit in another question. Andy, then Heidi.
It just looks like sports teams in the States now, doesn't it? I mean, and you see it with Trump, you see an awful lot of people who would not traditionally have been overly thrilled to see their favoured candidate or a candidate attached to their favoured party being in front of a dingy courtroom in Manhattan overpaying hush money to a porn star, which is definitely something that Gerald Ford wouldn't have done. A man who I wrote about in your excellent book, The Presidency.
You did, and a very good essay it was too, if I may.
But you never feel, both sides at the moment feel completely under threat. They're like sports fans who are annoyed that a referee's decision's gone the wrong way, and they're just convinced that they will keep fighting because they feel this injustice. How America brings itself back to being one political system is an interesting question if you look around the world in terms of the divides in ideology across, cultural issues, economic issues. There's not many two-party countries left. Ours is one, effectively, and the US is another, and in those two systems we have pretty nasty politics, so maybe the whole thing needs to split.
We've had a statement from Donald Trump's lawyer who describes the indictment as, quote, disappointing and sad. Sad is a very Donald Trump word, isn't it? Heidi?
Well, I think what's interesting, if not slightly terrifying, is that this whole process of him being in court about these hush payments to a porn star seems to be actually making him more popular with the Republican base and increasing his chances of getting the Republican nomination. I think he actively feeds off of conspiracy, division, mistrust of experts. And I think that's a very, very dangerous place for politics to get to.
Just on that, apparently his next court hearing has been set for the 4th of December, which seems an awfully long time ahead. But of course, it's only 2 months before the Republican primaries start. So that could have quite an impact. Let's move on to a final question. It's from Chris in Stubbington, who says, does the panel think to give a 270-hour community sentence to a man who raped a schoolgirl when he was 17 and she was 13 is an embarrassment to the Scottish justice system? This is I first saw this morning from a tweet from J.K. Rowling, who said that there is apparently a system in Scotland where if you're under 25, you are less likely to receive a punitive sentence for all sorts of different reasons. Heidi, let's start with you on this.
I'm gobsmacked by it, to be honest. I'm not an expert in the Scottish legal system. I understand that there's a process where the Crown can potentially challenge whether this sentence was appropriate, but the idea that someone rapes a 13-year-old girl and gets a community sentence, I don't think anyone in the UK, be they in Scotland, England or Wales, would think that was appropriate. I don't know the details of the case. Well, the judge in the case said,
when delivering his sentencing, he says, you're a first-time offender with no previous history of prison. You're 21 and was 17 at the time. Prison does not lead me to believe that this will continue to contribute to your rehabilitation. Michael?
Yeah, I mean, on the face of it, it does seem outrageous. I mean, there's a number of worrying. Why did it take 4 years from the crime to the sentencing? Also, to me, raises questions. I wonder what's happened there. This, on the face of it, does seem appalling. I suppose it's important to say that, we can focus on sentencing. The bigger issue when it comes to sexual offences, to me, seems to be investigation and charging. So only 1% of allegations of rape get to a charge, let alone a guilty conviction. So while I think the outrage at this is perfectly justified, I do think potentially there's a different part of the criminal justice system which is more outrageous than the sentences that are being handed out.
Andy?
Yeah, it's outrageous, and I agree with Michael on the general police attitude across, well, not police attitude, police capability when it comes to sexual assault.
But I mean, this was somebody who was brought to justice, found guilty, and then the victim and her family, I would have thought, will feel incredibly let down and thinking, well, is that it? Was it worth going through all of this for this?
I don't think that anyone would dispute that. I mean, it just, on the face of it, seems barking. The actual concept of, punishments for, there are enough kids who have done something stupid that have landed them in prison and it's changed their lives for the worse. And our prison system is not really fit for purpose either. I'm going through quite a list today of things that aren't fit for purpose, but in this case, no, quite obviously, that is someone that should have been banged up. And
Greg?
Yeah, I think there's a risk when you start treating criminals as the victims, and there is some merit to the fact that maybe if this young man has already served 4 years, then that's a different conversation.
Well, he hasn't.
But okay, then yeah, all the more horrendous that he's not done a day in jail. And then the question is, should he be on the street? Should he be out in society until he's properly rehabilitated? But this is what happens. It doesn't matter how good your police force is. If you have a DA like Alvin Bragg or Kim Foxx in Chicago or Chesa Bodine in San Francisco, who was recalled, believe it or not, in very democratic San Francisco, then it doesn't matter how many people you arrest. If the prosecutors decide that they shouldn't be indicted, then they just go free. And that's what's happening in America. And then the same thing here. If you have a great DA that properly prosecutes the case, but then the judge says, well, I'm not going to follow the laws, I'm going to let him go. So judges and DAs should follow the law that's determined by the legislatures.
Right, we've had a very serious programme today, but we're going to finish it off with, as usual, a fun question from Jenna in Manchester. Donald Trump is already selling T-shirts with a fake mugshot on them to raise campaign funds. If you were selling one piece of merch featuring a picture of you on it, what would it be and what would it say? I don't know if this has given you any ideas for your campaign in Swindon, Heidi.
Well, I know I annoy my opponent, who is a Welshman called Robert Buckland, by saying that I was born in Swindon, I went to school in Swindon. So my slogan has to be from Swindon for Swindon. As to what the picture would be and what the piece of merchandise would be, I don't know, but that would definitely be the slogan.
Greg?
That's a tough one. I think I would have some kind of merch with my favorite football team on it or something like that, but try to imply that I'm on the football team or the basketball team or whatever it is.
So it wouldn't have a photo of you on it then?
Well, it could have one that, with some heavy uniform on, so you can't see that I weigh 90 pounds.
Heavy uniform, Michael. Mine boggles.
I need a slogan that distinguishes myself from the panel, so I'm going to go for tax the rich. I think that's a message we don't hear enough in this country at the moment. And a cap. I'd like a red cap, but I'm going to have a different font to Donald Trump because I don't want it to look too Trumpian.
Yeah.
Andy?
A series of 1980s Big Bang themed merchandise celebrating the city's
study on.
We can go head to head.
Yeah.
Thank you all very much indeed. Heidi Alexander, Greg Swenson, Andy Silvester and Michael Walker. We still haven't had this statement from the DA. If we get it, we'll bring it to you in the next 60 minutes. But over the next hour, we're going to talk about disowning someone from your own family or disowning a friend, because today Philip Schofield, the TV star, has disowned his own brother, who was found guilty of sexually abusing a teenage boy over 3 years from the age of 13. Philip Schofield said in a statement on Instagram afterwards, "As far as I'm concerned, I no longer have a brother." I wonder if you've ever been in those circumstances where you felt the need to disown a family member, or maybe it's you that's been the one that has been disowned by other people. How does that work? Because I can't imagine disowning a member of my family or a close member of my family literally for anything. Can you? 0345 6060 973.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.